really beautiful land, and land that people use a lot for things like hiking and camping and fishing and hunting. So how do the people in this district think about the environment and caring for the land? And what are the types of legislation that they might really want to get behind?
Oregonians are passionate about the outdoors across the board. That's something that's near and dear. And public lands is a huge issue. Use of public lands is a huge issue. Over 50% of our state are public lands, and some federal and some state. And so it's a large part of who we are, and it's something that we take a lot of pride in, have a lot of love for. And I think, again, in these types of discussions, we don't want to narrow the folks who are having this type of discussion and try to lump them in one category. And this is where I think we often make a mistake in politics by limiting to folks who are classically of one political view or another. In public lands, there's a great opportunity to have a much broader conversation. For example, my wife's third cousin is a rancher who's been ranching Eastern Oregon for generations. And I went out and met with him on the ranch last fall, and we had a conversation about public lands. And he is a lifelong Republican. He is, used to be the head of the Cattlemen's Association, kind of a category of folks that a lot of Democrats or a lot of progressives typically would think of being on the other side of the fence on environmental issues. And he is passionate about keeping public lands public and the long-term sustainability of public lands. Because if we don't have that sustainability, then he can't pass on, his traditions to his kids and his grandkids. Ranching has been a key part of Oregon's public lands tradition for, since pre-statehood. So the language again becomes important. So he's not necessarily going to use the language of sustainability, but he'll talk about stewardship. But when we talk about what's behind those words, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. So language again becomes very important on how we talk about things. Getting folks to sit down to the table together and figure out how to manage these resources is critically important. And those are the conversations I think we need to have to be successful in the long run. So it's not a zero sum and win-lose. In terms of the use of public lands, there are some areas that different types of uses, because there are conflicting uses. So I think it is appropriate to limit and restrict some types of uses to different areas. And obviously we want to protect, vulnerable species and habitat and things like that. There are carve-out areas that there are carve-outs we need to do in order to protect some of those, some of the things that are part of our heritage. But we also want to be mindful of different types of uses and have those more open conversations. And we have a tradition of doing that in Oregon, especially in Central and Eastern Oregon. So one example is what referred to as the sage grouse solution. The sage grouse, if you haven't seen it, is a funky looking bird that was in danger of the species was in danger of starting to go extinct. This was a handful of years ago, and that was identified during the Obama administration. And instead of just listing the species, the local folks said, please don't list. We will work together to make sure that we will protect the species. But if you list the species, there are certain restrictions to the land that there's other things we can't do on the land. But we will work towards this common goal of achieving the overall goal of protecting the species. And so in their wisdom, the Obama administration said, okay, we'll let you do that. So you have to achieve this overall goal. And it's a very strict goal of protecting the species. But you guys on the ground can figure out how to do that. And if you can't do it, we will list. But if you can do it, we'll use that as an option, or we'll do that instead. And so folks came together, again, across party lines and political affiliation, all that other stuff, and sat down and figured out how they could both protect the species and maintain some of the traditional practices in the area. And it worked. Well, it worked up till this administration, who then took a very different approach. And now we're seeing some problems with it. But I think that's a really smart way to go about things. I don't think Washington, D.C. should be micromanaging. I do think Washington, D.C. should be setting high-level policy goals and providing resources to enable folks on the ground to achieve those goals. But I think government at its best is always a partnership at the federal, at the state, and the local level. And you don't get into as much of the headbutting if there's not the micromanagement. But if you do folks at the local level are still very committed to these big picture goals and often don't get the credit for wanting to achieve those big picture goals. But that's I think the best approach is to work with folks to accomplish them rather than to be more punitive in the approach, because otherwise folks will just sabotage what you're trying to accomplish.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you would like to make sure that our listeners know about you or your district?
Well, first of all, my website is jamiefororegon.com. That's JAMIEFOR Oregon, OREGON.com. And I think our politics in general needs to be moving to this bigger picture and broader perspective. I think our two-party system has been falling short in many ways, and that's why there's been growing frustration amongst the electorate. And I think that's why we had the shocking result we had in 2016 and are seeing the aftermath of that in our politics now. I don't think that's where most of the voters are at. I think most are looking for sensible, kind of bipartisan type solutions and want the best ideas to go forward regardless of who comes up with them. And I think the folks are really looking for leaders to step forward and be willing to challenge their own party when they think their own party's not paying attention, and also not addressing the issues that are important. Well, I think our rural areas have been really overlooked, and I think that's where there needs to be a lot more focus. So, I will say I believe, and I'm a lifelong Democrat, but I believe the Democratic Party has more traditionally, at least in recent years, focused on urban areas, and I think the Republican Party has really focused on corporations and big money interests. And that's left our rural areas ignored and the needs unaddressed. And so basic infrastructure things that are needed in our rural communities, water systems and clean water, broadband access, housing is critically important. Also healthcare, educational opportunities. All those things are critically important across our country, but especially in rural areas. And the way the allocation of resources have been established in the past have really favored urban areas. And so the frustration in rural areas is very real. And I think that's where we need to have attention and focus right now to really do the job of good governance. And simple things like, one of the things I talk about for education is an exchange of college education or trade school for public service, essentially a civilian GI Bill. Those opportunities for folks to be able to step forward and care for their families and care for their communities is what people are hungry for right now. And so I think regardless of the letter you have after your name, if we're not seeing those things and caring for those things, I think we're going to lose people. But that's the direction I think politics needs to go right now.
And the incumbent whom you're running against has an enormous amount of money. So if our listeners would like to help support you and your campaign, how can they do so?
Well, I would greatly appreciate that. Again, my probably the best way to donate is online, so it's jamiefororegon.com. Donation of funds is really helpful. Also, volunteering, making calls. Our volunteer base is over 800 at this point. Whereas we don't have as many dollars as we do, we have tremendous energy of folks throughout the district, throughout the state, and even outside our state who are looking to not just defeat Greg Walden, but defeat folks, the current leadership in Washington, D.C. who are hurting our country. And for those who live in and it's not just blue and red, because again, it's about bringing the best ideas forward, but folks who live in a really solid districts, I would encourage them to look at districts like mine where there's an opportunity for change. But my focus is really on sensible government and bipartisan good governance, which is the direction I believe our country needs to go. And I think is a huge opportunity for investment for those throughout our country who want to see change in Washington and accountability of what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. So there's money and donations. There are helping out with volunteers who can make calls or even text voters, because we're in there's different stages of ID and persuasion and things like that. There's also boosting social media. So Jamie for Oregon on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. So going on to those and helping to boost access and the word getting out that way. And then also calling people out, calling out hypocrisy. So in the case of my representative, he has led the attack on healthcare, which he's now remessaging. he's been in office 20 years, has ignored the opioid crisis for 20 years. And in the past, I wrote about it in January in an op-ed piece. And in the past couple months, he's suddenly talking about it. He hasn't done his job. And he and others like him who are not doing their job and taking care of folks, their hypocrisy needs to be called out. And so those are things that people can do through social media that can really have an impact on my race and others.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I think that this is a really exciting race, and I hope that our listeners will get involved, because it sounds like Oregon, the 2nd District of Oregon, really needs some representation that's going to listen to their needs.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Imunari, and we're using it with express permission of the band. Our logo and all original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and is done expressly for Two Broads Talking Politics. We can be found on our website at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com. You can reach us by email at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com, on Twitter at twobroadstalk, on Facebook and Instagram, and you can support us on patreon.com. You can find our podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and anywhere podcasts are found. If you are interested in advertising on Two Broads Talking Politics, please email us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com.